nuclear warheads to different countries. So going into the MILSTAR failure, MILSTAR failure 2. MILSTAR 2 was launched on, again, a Titan IV. It was launched on May 1st, 1990. Nothing happened on the first stage. Everything was nominal, but during that upper stage, they had misfires 3 times, had not the correct timing, and at different durations that could have got it to the particular mission. They tried to separate it, or it separated at lower orbit. The mission operators took over, tried to salvage the mission, tried to get the spacecraft into the proper orbit, but it could not. It did not have enough fuel to get it to that orbit. Later on, they found out the root cause was that the software had some database errors. There was attitude control loss, and again, the insertion burns were incorrect and didn't perform according to plan. So mitigation steps. So some of the mitigation steps that came from the MILSTAR 2 disaster was the independent review teams that were stood up for different government agencies like NRO, and then NASA, and then also now Space Force. Another thing was they reviewed what it needed. They created a more robust review process, and then finally created a new acquisition strategy for the launch vehicles. So for the independent the review teams, their primary mission was only to perform risk assessments on technical risk. For programs offices, usually you do some type of risk assessment, but usually technical risks are looked at both technical side, cost side, performance side, and by looking at all those, you determine what is the best mitigation step. But for this independent review team, all they cared about was what technical risk would do to the mission. Is it mission failure? What's the probability? And how do you mitigate this risk? Is it mitigated by, not by cost or schedule, but by actual fix? And the only way to mitigate it, or the only way to mitigate most of these technical risks, is by finding the root cause and fixing it. So most of these independent ratings review teams were inserted both in Space Missile Command, now Space System Command, and also NRO and NASA. These teams were injected into both the spacecraft and launch vehicles. They provided another layer of assurance for the Portfolio Execution Officer, which is the Space and Missile Center Command General, and he's usually a 3-star at that level. So it was very important that the general or commander of SMC had this team injected, not only looking at the risk from a different point of view, but also looking at not having influence from contractors or cost or schedule. These teams also had the same authority going into some of these reviews as a go or no-go decision makers. Now, some people would think these personnel should not have these authorities, but it is very important to have these checks and balances and independent ideas to look at, again, at the problem at a different aspect and not be influenced by being too closely involved with the mission, also too closely involved with working with the vendor. Some of these teams are made up of different engineers from different technical backgrounds, from propulsion to electronics to whatever it took to solve the problem. And again, they were inserted into all the different program offices that develop spacecraft and launch vehicles inside Space and Missiles. Another mitigation step was to create a more robust review process. So when spacecraft are going through this new review process, they would have to go through a consent to ship, consent to fuel, and also flight readiness review. Now, launch vehicles would also go through some of the same reviews, but in the end, the final review is the most important for the launch vehicle, while the first two are the most important for the spacecraft. So you do not ship a spacecraft to the launch facility for processing unless it is ready to go. You've presented all the risks to the commanding officer responsible for these, and he understands what risks he's going to take sending these spacecrafts into orbit with whatever malfunctions or errors that could ensue of a bad component. Now, for launch vehicles, you have a little bit more time, but for the launch vehicles, it is also a production task, not so much a design and develop. Most of these launch vehicles have been put together 1,000 times for similar missions. So most of the components have been reviewed over and over again. So when they are finally integrated, that is when you find out if there is any risk involved. And at the flight readiness review, that is where the commander can, or everyone says, hey, there is a go or no go for this launch. And in the end, if there is no go, then you are taking that spacecraft off the launch vehicle and you're fixing whatever component needs to be fixed on that launch vehicle. For example, true life story. One time there was some components on the first stage of the Atlas V rocket that need to be fixed. We took the spacecraft off the launch vehicle, and because I was part of Launch Enterprise at one point, and we had about a 2-month fix, so that mission got delayed for 2 months to get that component fixed, first stage engine fixed. Finally, we had the acquisition strategy. So Space and Missile Command created a different acquisition strategy. It was a 2-phase approach. Now it is a 3-phase approach. The first stage was to carry 4 different companies in the industry and see which companies could make it and offer a bid up to the second stage. The first phase was more for seeing what companies could develop, and some of the costs that would be ensued to develop those. Going into the phase 2, though, only 3 of those companies out of the 4 were able to bid and had a viable solution. So the 4 companies that were given money to develop in the first phase were SpaceX, Northrop, Blue Origin, and ULA. In the second stage, only Blue Origin, ULA and SpaceX had a viable solution at that point, and they the Space Force down selected to two launch vehicles, launch providers, and those launch providers have demonstrated over the years to be superior to the third and even fourth vendor that the Space Force gave money to, and they were SpaceX and Blue Origin, or SpaceX and ULA. Now there is a phase three. Phase three is another recompete, but they are giving more latitude in the phase three by having two different lanes. The first lane is a more R&D program, only has to get to one or a couple different orbits, while the phase two or the phase three lane two is a more lengthy contract. So phase three, lane one is only 1 year at a time, while phase three, lane two is a 4 year, but they have more strict requirements gained two different different orbits. So, in conclusion, we had a problem with our launch enterprise and getting very expensive assets into orbit, and we fixed it by having by inserting a independent review team, also building a more robust review program, and finally building a more competitive acquisition strategy that allowed the development of two very reliable and dependable systems like SpaceX and ULA's rockets. Well, thank you for allowing me to share my presentation on the MILSTAR to failure.